This is going to be your third recording on Jacob Lawrence, and it's going to focus on the series of PowerPoint presentation slides between 14 and 23. Hopefully I can get through all of them in under 15 minutes. But the theme here is to discuss the imagery of trains and railroads in this migration series of his. So we'll start in slide number 14. And I want you to think about everything that the train and the railroad embodies, all its complexities, all its symbols of hope, all of its symbols of lost hope, travel, passage, movement, all these ideas that are embodied perfectly within this train metaphor. Now, this is not the first time we've seen, and I'm in slide number 14 in the PowerPoint, which is panel number 5. This is not the first time we've seen a train in art. We've looked at many different Western artists, starting with Turner, Rain, Steam, Speed, the train, that embodiment of progress, that embodiment of industrialization. We've looked at Monet, specifically with his multiple paintings, serialized images of train stations. And always this train in the Western art tradition is the symbol of progress, the symbol of the industrial, the symbol, if you want to even go with the Turner understanding, this industrial sublime. Now, here the train has a completely different set of meanings, but still there's this idea of progress that is an underlying motif here. What is the train doing in this series? Well, this train is transporting people from an impoverished livelihood in the southern part of the United States to a hopefully better, more promising future in the northern part of the United States. Remember, Jacob Lawrence has already done a whole series on the life of Harriet Tubman. Why does she become the iconic hero that she is? Well, primarily because of her work on the Underground Railroad. This is this system, this network of travel routes and safe homes which transported slaves from the southern part of the United States to the northern part and eventually into Canada. So all of these coded words that were associated with the Underground Railroad, such as a conductor or a station, all of this would have been familiar to an African-American audience. All of this would have been familiar to Jacob Lawrence because of his countless hours of research. So the train, even though it has a slightly different symbol in this particular series of artworks, still has that idea, that underlying idea of progress that's attached to it. So here in panel number 5, slide number 14, the voyage begins. The movement of the train begins. And look, if I already mentioned this to you, but if you want to see the paintings in their chronological flow, go back to the MoMA website. But here I've just compiled scenes of trains and this idea of the movement and the forward trajectory of the people coming from the south to the north. Now it says in this caption that a lot of the northern industries were going to be paying for the passage of people coming from the south to the north. This was true in the beginning parts of the Great Migration. This ends up being not so true towards the years following, primarily because the white industry owners of the north realized that there was such a desire to escape the south that there was no need to further incentivize the trip. The passages were paid for readily in many cases by the people coming from the south. Although there are examples of industries in the north being able to work out some kind of payment plan so that the people, once they secured their jobs in the north, were able to repay them. So I'm going to move to the next slide, number 15, which is panel number 6 of the series. What is the historical background for this migration? Well, primarily World War I has a major impact into why there was such a great flow of people. What happened was that Europeans had, as they're engulfed in war, have a major desire or a greater desire for American industrial goods. So the rate of production of these industrial goods that are being manufactured in the northern industrial cities of the United States has exponentially increased. And so when that increases, you need a greater number of workers to fill those requirements. So this is when a lot of the labor sources are being sought out from elsewhere. Also, the cheap labor that traditionally had been filling those northern American cities was coming from Europe, was coming from impoverished populations of Europe, and they were making crossings from their homelands and their home countries in Europe. They were crossing the Atlantic Ocean to come to these northern United States cities. But during World War I, what happens is, because everybody is embroiled in war, a lot of these pockets of people are no longer able to continue their journeys to the port cities to be able to make it to the United States. So there's a blocking of sorts of the number of European immigrants that are able to come and fill these jobs. And then in 1917, when the United States officially enters World War I, about 3 million men are deployed. They're enlisted into the war efforts and they're deployed to Europe. And so you have this kind of perfect storm. You have an increased demand for industrial goods. You have a decreased supply of cheap labor coming from countries in Europe. And you have the loss of American men. So what do the industrial leaders do? What do the owners of these manufacturing plants do? Well, they look to sources of labor that had previously been ignored, which are women and African Americans. So this is the beginning. This World War I has this major impact in the beginning of the flow of people to the northern part of the United States. So here in this image, in panel number 15, which is slide number 6, or vice versa, slide 15, panel 6, you can see all the people here packed on the train. You can see on the left a woman in a yellow outfit. She's nursing a child. Look, as we look at these scenes, for all the different imagery of mothers and children, mothers nursing children. This is something that Lawrence will often incorporate. In this passage, it's hard for you not to think of when we studied Kerry James Marshall and Kerry James Marshall's paintings of Great America, that you have this passage of people from Africa into the United States and what occurs. There's another painting he has called Baptism, Kerry James Marshall's Baptism. That transformation that occurs between the identity of being whatever your tribe, your ethnicity, your cultural group was in Africa, to that complete erasure, that complete loss of that identity as you become an African American in the United States system, or a slave in the United States terms. This is, once again, a transformation. This is no longer the Atlantic Ocean, but this is the train route. This becomes the new identity that's formed, the different stories that are going to be told, the different identities that are going to be formed as a people move from one area to another area. And remember, not only was Jacob Lawrence reading voraciously the sources of information that he had at the community centers and libraries and cultural centers in Harlem, but he's also listening to the people on the streets. He is talking to acquaintances, teachers, friends, that had themselves migrated. These are, in Harlem, because you have such an influx of population, this is such a communal experience. So these narrations, remember he's writing the captions first, these ideas that he is describing are coming from a variety of sources, including anecdotes of the people that he knew in Harlem. Moving to the next slide, which is panel number 12, you can see 3 lines of people lining up to get tickets. And you can also see in the foreground 2 white uniformed men with their nightsticks. So here we are in a train station waiting for tickets. And in the southern part of the United States, Remember, we are still in Jim Crow America, Jim Crow South. There were specific wait lines and waiting rooms and even train cars, they were called Jim Crow cars, specifically for the African American population. And once people were aboard the trains, you weren't even allowed to move between one car and another because on these trains there were also white passengers who, of course, had free range of movement. But everything was segregated, and oftentimes it's known that once the trains crossed the Mason-Dixon line, those segregated car divisions were relaxed and the African American population could move around the train cars more freely. But if you look here in that center line, you can see a baby wrapped in white. Once again, you can see that image of the baby, which is always giving us this forward idea of hope, this message of a brighter future, a greater day lying ahead. But what you can see here is the throngs and the masses of people all gathered together, all waiting to get these tickets north. It gives you this idea of the great expectation and the great numbers of people. Now, there is, I had mentioned before, this Jim Crow cars. In 1941, remember that's the exact same year of the series, there is a famous song by the blues singer Josh White called the Jim Crow Train. And so I'm going to play you a little passage of this song so you can see, as I've mentioned many times before, it's not just Jacob Lawrence that is creating art that is responding to the Great Migration, but it's also musicians. So this is called Jim Crow Train by Josh White.
Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Oh Lord, this train is Jim Crow.
And there's a certain pulsation in that music. There's a certain rhythm lining up to get tickets. And you can also see in the foreground two white uniformed men with their nightsticks. So here we are in a train station waiting for tickets. And in the southern part of the United States, remember, we are still in Jim Crow America, Jim Crow South. There were specific wait lines and waiting rooms and even train cars, they were called Jim Crow cars, specifically for the African American population. And once people were aboard the trains, you weren't even allowed to move between one car and another because on these trains there were also white passengers who, of course, had free range of movement. But everything was segregated, and oftentimes it's known that once the trains crossed the Mason-Dixon line, those segregated car divisions were relaxed and the African American population could move around the train cars more freely. But if you look here in that center line, you can see a baby wrapped in white. Once again, you can see that image of the baby, which is always giving us this forward idea of hope, this message of a brighter future, a greater day lying ahead. But what you can see here is the throngs and the masses of people all gathered together, all waiting to get these tickets north. It gives you this idea of the great expectation and the great numbers of people. Now, there is, I had mentioned before, this Jim Crow cars. In 1941, remember that's the exact same year of the series, there is a famous song by the blues singer Josh White called the Jim Crow Train. And so I'm going to play you a little passage of this song so you can see, as I've mentioned many times before, it's not just Jacob Lawrence that is creating art that is responding to the Great Migration, but it's also musicians. So this is called Jim Crow Train by Josh White.
Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Can't you hear that train whistle blow? Oh Lord, this train is Jim Crow.
And there's a certain pulsation in that music. There's a certain rhythm that's kept to imitate the notion of the train. And remember, we're looking at this whole section of paintings from the train, and you can see that I started with panel number 5, then I jumped to panel number 6, and now we're in panel number 12. There is this constant sort of pulsation in forward movement that is resembling the actual movement of the train. In number 17, slide number 17, which is panel 21, so we've jumped. Here we are again, the families waiting for their trains to come. And we can see in this scene that gazing out of the people who are coming to the train station, waiting for their trains, and what they're looking at is their southern way of life. They are looking at, you can see that agriculture in the distance, you can see the rows of landscape. There's this idea that the southern culture has a much slower pace, isn't as industrialized. It's not the urban centers. This is to juxtaposition the kind of barren landscape of the South. There's nothing that necessarily is obstructing your view or of your space. And when we get to cities or scenes from the urban centers, go back to this panel number 21, and you can see how Lawrence is depicting the notion of the South versus the notion of the North. In the South, what do we have time to do? Well, we have time to kind of look back, to gaze, to ponder, to recollect the kind of slower pace of the South, whereas when we get to the North, there's a certain hustle and bustle and constant movement and constant obstructions, and your vision is always impeded by the skyscrapers, the industrial smokestacks, everything that is not only a change between the Southern way of life, but also it is a completely different way of living your life. The landscape has changed, and the rhythms and the cadences and the movements have also changed. In slide number 18, which is panel number 23, and after this one I'll stop the recording and do another one. But this is a scene that you who live in New York City all know so well. You are waiting on a subway platform to get on a train. The seats, you can see inside of those train cars, the seats have already filled up, and there are many more people to get on the train before you get. You know that with all these people that are online in front of you, that you are going to be standing. And this idea of movement, this push, this shove of people to know that the voyage is long, the journey is long, the seats are all taken up, and the discomfort, the idea of the multitude just thronging to get into this place. But it moves you to understand that great desire that you will take the voyage, no matter the cost, no matter the discomfort, because the future that awaits you in the North is promised to be so much greater than what you know in the southern part of the United States.